Hi folks, and welcome to the Is It Worth It for the L-60, a Tier 2 premium Swedish light tank. This tank was the Christmas gift in December 2016, so it's been a year since this tank has been available in the game, and it's been a year since I've been meaning to get around to reviewing it, but it's not currently available from the tech tree or the gift shop, but if you missed out on it first time round, I have absolutely no doubts that it will be available in some shape or form in the future, probably as a part of a package, as pretty much has happened with all the other gift tanks. So anyway, let's get to it and start with the history. So the history of the L-60, which for its time was probably the most advanced tank in the world, but its history begins with in the 1920s. So prior to 1930, Landsverk were a Swedish company that mainly made railway cars and carriages. But on Sweden's secret purchase of 10 LK2s from Germany in 1920, Landsverk were the company that were tasked with converting them into the Stridsvagn FM21, which is the Tier 1 we have in game. So that happened in the early 1920s. Now, in the late 1920s, Landsverk also modernized them into the Stridsvagn M21, M29, or FM21, FM29. So essentially, Landsverk were basically the only Swedish company with any experience with tanks at all prior to the 1930s. Now, Sweden's neutral status, along with the fact it already had steel and engineering industries that were developed, suddenly became very, very useful and interesting to the Germans. Basically, Germany were under the cosh. They were limited by the Versailles Agreement as to developing their steel and engineering industries, as to developing war machines or tanks. But, you know, Sweden were neutral, but yet they had developed steel and engineering industries, and, you know, they were very, very close by. So Germany used Swedish companies to bypass the Versailles Agreement. Now, even though Landsverk is recognized as a Swedish company, if you were to actually trace their history, they were actually owned by a German company, which was in turn owned by another German company, which was in turn owned by MAN. Now, MAN was, you'll probably know from other videos, but MAN basically built the Tiger. They built a lot of the most iconic German tanks during World War II. They were a tank-building powerhouse during the 1940s, but essentially in the 1930s, or from 1930 on, they couldn't do anything because of the Versailles Agreement, so they got around the agreement by basically owning Landsverk through a series of shell companies. And it wasn't just Landsverk. Bofors, which was another Swedish company, were also partly owned by Krupp, and again, you'll know who Krupp are. So, you know, not only were there Swedish engineering and steel companies, you know, either partially or fully owned through shell companies, German shell companies, they also employed German engineers. So there were two German engineers in particular that were hired by Landsverk, Otto Merker and Joseph Vollmer. Now, Otto Merker and Joseph Vollmer had previously worked on designs for the LK2, which as I mentioned, was, you know, Germany's light tank that was built or bought by Sweden and converted into the Stridsvagn FM21. They had also worked on the Gross tractor and the Like tractor, so they were the top German engineers that were trying to develop Germany's secret tank building program. And they were both working at Landsverk. And they were working at Landsverk, or they were hired by Landsverk, with essentially the intention of designing and building a tank for Germany, and therefore bypassing the Versailles Agreement. Now, the result of, you know, the two engineers working at Landsverk was Sweden's first domestically produced tank, which was a tank called the L-10. Now, this was a tank that used a German Maybach engine, and it used the turret, or a turret very similar to the turret that was used on the Lick tractor. It also had a 37mm gun that was built by Bofors, but as I mentioned, Bofors was partially owned by Krupp. So the gun that was built, the 37mm that was built for the L-10, not only was built by Bofors, which were partially owned by a German company, but the design for the gun had been designed in Germany. So, you know, the German influence on tank building in Sweden was absolutely huge, but essentially, the tank was basically considered too complicated and too expensive. The Swedish army weren't interested in the L-10. Again, you know, as a lot of criticism goes towards German tanks, they were incredibly good machines, but they were far too complicated and they were built to perfection. And essentially, they were too expensive. You know, where other countries during World War II ended up building cheaper tanks so that they could be mass-produced more easily, you know, Germany preferred to focus on quality rather than quantity. And that was the problem with the L-10. It was just far too complicated, and it was far too expensive, and as I say, the Swedish army weren't interested. So Landsverk went back to the drawing board and they redesigned the tank as the Landsverk L-30. Now, they ended up building 3 prototypes of the L-30, but again, it was still far too technically, it was far too well engineered, and it was still far too expensive for Sweden to buy it. On top of that, most of Europe was suffering from a financial crisis at the time. This was the 1930s. Unemployment was high, finances were short, and no one was that interested in buying an expensive tank. But Landsverk continued to develop the tank, the L-30, and they originally, it basically turned into the L-60. And they decided that, if Sweden weren't interested in buying the L-60, they should try to export it. Now, the original L-60 was designed, it was finished on paper in blueprints in 1931. And in 1931, on paper, compared to the LAS, which basically was a tank that would later become known as the Panzer I, the Panzer I was a tank that was being developed side by side with the L-60 in secret by Krupp. But on paper, the LAS, or the Panzer I, and the L-60, they weren't, very much different from each other. They were almost identical. They were pretty much the same tank. So the Germans weren't interested in, this new L-60 because it was very, very similar to the Panzer I. But, that still didn't stop Landsverk from continuing to improve the L-60 while it was on paper. Now, some of the improvements were similar to improvements that were being made to the Panzer I. As I say, they were being developed side by side. It got a new turret. It was made longer and heavier, and the transmission was changed. So with these improvements in 1934, both the Soviets and Ireland declared an interest in the design. They liked how it looked on paper. Work continued on the blueprint, and, it didn't stop the Swedish or the Germans from improving the tank. Even though, 2 countries were now interested in the tank, the designs meant that the tank still got a new engine. It got a new 2-man turret, and eventually Ireland said, "Grand, we'll take 2, we'll buy 2. But Otto Merker, the German engineer, continued with the improvements even though the tank had been sold. Germany were essentially using the L-60 as a test bed for their own designs, and now that the tank was actually going to be built, they wanted to do more than just improve the tank on paper. They wanted to test more innovations on an actual working tank that could bypass the Versailles Agreement. So as a result, even though Ireland had already agreed to buy the L-60 as it was on paper, the L-60 was given a brand new prototype suspension designed by Ferdinand Porsche, the torsion bar suspension. Now, the suspension had actually been designed by Ferdinand Porsche for the Panzer I, but Germany rejected the suspension, I actually don't know why they rejected it, but essentially, the opportunity to build and test it on the L-60 couldn't be missed. So even though the plans didn't mention a torsion bar suspension when Ireland bought the tank, the opportunity to put a torsion bar suspension on the L-60 couldn't be missed. So the L-60 ended up becoming the first tank in history to use a torsion bar suspension. Now, to fit the torsion bar suspension, basically the hull had to be lengthened to fit the suspension. And again, that wasn't in the plans Ireland bought, but, Landsverk and the German engineers did it anyway before Ireland could buy the tank. So they lengthened the hull of the tank in order to fit the suspension. And actually, by lengthening the hull of the tank, they actually resolved some of the problems that the prototype was having. Basically, the engine compartment ended up being bigger because of the new suspension, and that actually resolved overheating problems that the engine had been having. And on top of that, because the length of the hull was increased, the road wheels and idlers fit the tracks better, and that meant that the driver now had more control over the tank, and it had far less chance of detracking itself during maneuvers. In fact, by the time the Irish arrived to see their 2 L-60s undergoing trials in 1935, it was a completely different tank from the one they had bought on paper. It was longer, it was wider, it was heavier, it had a power-to-weight ratio that was better, it was faster than the original tank on paper. In fact, other than the engine and the turret, absolutely everything else had been changed on the tank or had been redesigned. Now, the L-60 impressed during trials. In fact, it was incredibly successful during its trials while the Irish watched, apart from one minor problem. Although, no, okay, it wasn't a minor problem. There was one major problem during the trials. You see, two L-60s have been built. Ireland had bought two L-60s. Both L-60s were undergoing trials. They were passing the trials very, very successfully, until one of the L-60s went on fire due to driver error and completely burned out while the Irish watched. Now, I imagine that would go along something along the lines of basically the Irish contingent would have turned around to the Swedish engineers, or the German engineers as they were, and basically said, okay, well, the trials were going well. We'll take the one that's working, but the one that happens to be on fire, maybe you need to work on the heating system a little bit. I don't know, but regardless, they probably would have made some sort of joke about it. But essentially, the Irish took the one that didn't go on fire home with them. And the deal was that Landsverk needed to build another L-60 at their own expense, because basically the second one had been written off. And the Irish would come back a year later and pick it up. So essentially, because of the German need to test new technology on a tank, Ireland ended up bringing home with them in 1935 the very first L-60 that was probably the most technological advanced tank of its time. It was incredibly advanced for its time. There wasn't any other tank in existence that could even match it. Now, essentially, both L-60s that Ireland bought, the first one in 1935 and the second one in 1936, this is it. This is the first one that was ever built in 1935. The second one that Ireland bought in 1936 still exists as well, although it's been gutted. It's in an Irish museum, and it was basically stripped for parts in order to keep the first one working, which is, as I say, the first one ever built, L-60 in 1935. Ignore the Irishman in front of it. Essentially, I didn't know what this was until I got my hands on the tank. This is still running. It's it's one of only two L-60s in the world that are still running, but this L-60 is still running. It was in the Curragh army camp. It usually is in the museum as a still running tank, but on the day I visited to see my baby, basically the fuel tank was being replaced, or was being fixed, so it was in the workshop, and thankfully they let me in to have a look at the tank, get my hands on it in the workshop. And yeah, I was always wondering, I actually, until I got my hands on the tank, I wasn't quite sure what this was. I thought maybe ventilation, maybe viewport, and it turned out it's a cover for the light. I did not know that, so I'm a scrub. But anyway, yeah, the L-60, first one ever built right here, and as I say, ignore the Irishman in front of it. But the first two that were ever built, as I say, they still exist, although one isn't running and one is. But essentially, Landsverk hoped that with two Irish tanks running, you know, as in they'd actually built them and they were working and had passed their trials, they hoped that basically other countries, or maybe Sweden, would be interested in purchasing the tank. But Sweden still decided not to buy the tank. In fact, they decided to go for a more, well-known tank at that time called the LT-VZ-38, which was a Czechoslovakian tank from Skoda. So they rejected the chance of buying the L-60s because essentially it was still a brand new tank, and even though only two had been built, they were basically prototypes, and even though it was incredibly advanced, it just hadn't had any combat training. It hadn't been involved in combat, it hadn't been in existence long enough, so they ended up buying 90 LT-VZ-38s from Skoda in Czechoslovakia. Now, with the tank actually being built and running, in 1936, Austria asked for a tank to be built, and Landsverk built a prototype for Austria, but even before the Austrians looked at it, they changed their mind and rejected it. Shortly after that, the Polish showed some interest, but once again changed their minds. And then finally, the Hungarians in late 1936 showed interest and asked for the L-60 prototype that had been built for Austria to be sent to Hungary for trials. Now, interestingly, they had also bought a Panzer I, so they basically tested the L-60 against the Panzer I in the same trial in Hungary in 1936, and it basically was found that the L-60 was superior to the Panzer I in almost every single way. So Hungary rejected the Panzer I, and they signed a licensing agreement with Landsverk to produce their own version of the tank, which would become known as the Taldi 38M. Now, in 1937, Sweden, despite the Army's lukewarm approach to the L-60, changed their minds, and they went back to Landsverk and they basically decided that, well, okay, if other countries are showing interest and are starting to buy the L-60, okay, we'll buy some too. So we'll buy 15 of them, but we'll only buy 15 of them if you make changes to the tank. So essentially, the tank ended up having to receive a new engine. The hull got even longer. The gun was changed from a 20mm to a 37mm Bofors, again designed in Germany. It received new machine guns, a new cupola, and new observation devices. Now, even though the production name was L-60, just like the tanks that had been built for Ireland and Hungary, once the tank was serving with the Swedish Armed Forces and had all the changes made, the tanks were renamed to the Stridsvagn M38, which we have in game. Now, with Germany's annexation of Czechoslovakia in 1939, the 90 LTVZ-38s that Sweden had ordered and had actually been built and were basically just waiting to be shipped to Sweden, those 90 tanks were commandeered and they were integrated into the German Panzer Corps. And Sweden weren't very happy. They really weren't very happy. So essentially they ended up having to approach Landsverk again, and they ended up asking for more L-60 variants to basically replace the LTVZ-38s that they had originally bought. So that resulted in a lot of other Stridsvagn M variants, which were all based on the L-60. Now, I've covered all their history on the various Ace Tanker videos for the Swedish tanks, but essentially what ended up happening was Landsverk ended up building the L-60 or L-60 variants in larger numbers for the Swedish army. Also, they ended up getting the contract. Sweden complained about the LTVZ-38s being stolen. They complained so much that eventually Germany gave Skoda permission for the plans for the LTVZ-38 to be given to Sweden. Sweden got the plans for the LTVZ-38s, and they gave the plans to Landsverk, and Landsverk ended up building 200 LTVZ-38s, Swedish built and built to the original plans from Skoda, and those 200 tanks ended up being used by the Swedish Army. Again, it's a tank we don't have in game, but just a little bit of history I thought you might be interested in. But anyway, to cut a long story short, because I love this tank, it's my baby, and I've probably talked too much about the history, but essentially the Landsverk L-60, for its time, it was probably the most advanced tank in the world, although it wasn't recognized as such. It was pretty much ignored by pretty much everyone. But essentially, it was built by Sweden, but it was designed by by German engineers, by Swedish companies that had links to German companies. It was designed using German designed components. It was built to German engineering standards, and it used the first torsion bar suspension, German built and German designed ever. It had a power to weight ratio of over 22, which was incredibly good for the time. It could travel up to speeds up to 45 kilometers an hour. Again, incredibly good for its time. It used sloped armor long before most of the other tanks in the world at that time were using it. It was just an amazing tank. Oh, and it also came with radios as standard. So at that time, most of the tanks being built, they still used a flag system for communication. Every L-60 came with a radio as standard. It basically also had the most advanced optics available at the time. So it was an incredibly beautiful tank, even though it wasn't recognized as such at the time. It was and still is beautiful. It's my baby, the L-60. Anyway, let's get on with the video. So as per usual, we're going to be comparing the L-60 against all the other Tier 2 premium light tanks or gift tanks in the game, but I don't have them all up here. I've just included the ones with autoloaders because the 20mm on the L-60 is an autoloader. So we're going to be comparing autoloaders versus all the other autoloaders. That means it's up against the Light 6C, the Panzer II-D, the T2 Light, the T7 Combat Car, and the T1E6. But before I do, and before I start talking about the gun, I'm just going to point out that this gun on the L-60 is the same same as the stock gun on the other Tier 2 Swedish tanks. So what you can see is already the gun is worse, even though it's the same gun on the L-60 as the Volkswagen M38 and the PV-LVV FM42. It's worse. Basically, it gets less penetration, it gets less alpha damage, it gets less DPM than the two tanks using the same gun as stock at Tier 2. So that's already a negative against the gun on the tank. But compared to the other Tier 2 premium light tanks, it's okay. Even though it's worse than the stock gun on the Swedish tanks, it's actually okay. What you can see here is the DPM, not great, but it's average compared to autoloaders. The penetration, once again, not great at 27, but it's average compared to the other autoloaders. I mean, it's better than the Panzer II-D. The alpha damage, again, not amazing, but it's average. There doesn't seem to be anything special about the gun, but the rate of fire is a little bit slow. You do get a clip size of 10, and in-game it means every time you pull the trigger you actually fire 2 shots. The reload time is okay, but as I say, DPM hurts on the tank. It's nothing special. Shell velocity is okay at 805, and the ammo capacity, you've got plenty of ammunition, and the potential damage is again average. So even though it's worse than the stock gun on the Swedish tanks compared to the other Tier 2 premium light tanks with autoloaders, it's a very, very average gun, if not slightly below average. So nothing special regarding the gun. And once again, gun handling, it's good and it's bad. First of all, it's good in that it gets 10 degrees of gun depression, but most of the other premium tanks do as well. Even the Panzer II-D gets 10mm or 10 degrees of gun depression. It only beats the T2 Light, and the T7 combat car has it beaten. So 10 degrees is good, but it's, you know, not great compared to the other Tier 2 light tanks. Now, it's a negative for the aim time in that it's got the worst aim time of 1.92, and because it's an autoloader, it means that, you know, even when you pull the trigger and you fire 2 shots, you've got to go through that aim time again. So, you know, it affects the accuracy, it affects the a number of shots that are going to be hitting the enemy tanks, because the reticule on the tank just gets huge between shots. Every time you fire 2 shots, the aim time is awful. So the gun dispersion, again, looks good on paper, but, you know, it beats all the other tanks. But again, because of this aim time and because you're firing 2 shots, you know, every time you pull the trigger, it's not great. It causes you to miss a lot of shots. So on paper, the accuracy is okay, but I'd say even though it's better than most of the other tanks, the accuracy is very, very similar. The soft gun stats are actually very, very good for the tank, you know, firing on the move, during traverse, during turret traverse, better than most of the other tanks, but the problem, again, is the aim time. So the gun is pretty disappointing on the tank, if I'm completely honest, even though it looks fairly average. When it comes to mobility, once again, nothing special here. Top speed of 48 kilometers an hour is okay, but compared to the other light tanks with autoloaders, nothing special. It's got the worst top speed, even though it's not bad. The reverse speed at 20 kilometers an hour is pretty good, very, very similar, or the same as the rest of the tanks up here. The engine power, again, nothing special, very, very average. Power to weight ratio, 2192 is a positive, but once again, it's good, but some of the other tanks have it beaten. The terrain resistance is actually quite good on the tank. In fact, the terrain resistance beats a lot of the other tanks up here, so you can reach your top speed as a result. The power to weight ratio and good terrain resistance means that you can reach your top speed even though you're not as fast as some of the other light tanks. So mobility, I would say, is fairly average. Nothing special there either. So average gun handling, average mobility for all the premium gift tanks or premium tanks, and then we come down to armor and health, and it's just negatives. You've got absolutely no armor. I mean, most of the tanks down here don't have very much armor, but, you know, even so, the L-60 has the worst. It's got 13mm of hull, 13mm side hull, 7 on the rear. Turret armor is 13mm all round. Now, again, remember I was saying during the history, this was a tank that was designed to compete with the Panzer I, and, you know, it was built at the same time as the Panzer I, so it's actually got very, very similar hull armor to the Panzer I at 13mm. Now, one of the things that does disappoint me about the tank is its view range, which is, again, average, nothing special here at 280 for a Tier 2, but for its time, it had the most advanced optics in the world, and yeah, it could have been reflected in game and given this tank a strength, but the view range is pretty poor at 280. Some of the other tanks are similar, but the Light 6C and the Panzer IID have it well beaten. So even the radio range is the worst radio range. So view range, nothing special, and the radio range is pretty poor on the tank. So yeah, it's looking like a very, very average to poor tank. You know, averages regarding gun, mobility, and then poor. Pretty bad tank as regards armor and health. Health is actually okay, actually. Health is 182nd best health, so I suppose that is a strength. Okay, its health is a little bit better than the other tanks, but the view range and radio range is amongst the worst, so it's a hit and miss tank. Doesn't look very good on paper. So is the armor really as bad as advertised? Well, this is a tank that basically has sloped armor. One of the first tanks ever to use sloped armor. So essentially that 13mm turns into 20mm. So it's slightly better than advertised, at least on the upper hull. The lower glacis is about 18, upper hull 20, so that's okay. This gun mantle covers most of the front of the turret, but unfortunately it's only 13mm thick and there's no armor behind it. So the turret can be pinned incredibly easy. It may be possible if you're angled and get lucky that you might be able to bounce a couple of shots with your frontal hull, but don't count on it. You can hit the side of the turret and it's slightly sloped and angled, so you might get bounces off the side of the slope, but or a side of the turret, but essentially the armor is 13 pretty much everywhere, other than the front of the tank, and the rear is absolutely garbage. So you're not going to be basically bouncing very many shots. If you do, it's going to be luck, but it's still worth trying to angle in case people are trying to shoot your upper glacis, and you can get up to about 22, and if they get a low penetration RNG roll, they might bounce, but don't count on it. So essentially this is a tank that needs to use its mobility and its power to weight ratio to avoid getting shot and try and use its 10 degrees of gun depression. But the armor, nothing special here. So let's check out this gun and this engine in action. We are here on Himmelsdorf. It's an all tier 2 game, so a good matchup for the tank. And there's only one M2 light on either side. So as per usual in tier 2 games these days, I carry quite a lot of premium ammunition. Not for any tank other than the M2 light, and the moment the M2 light is spotted, I've got to switch to premium ammunition because my regular ammunition cannot hurt this guy. It's going to take me 2 clips if I hit and pen every single shot to kill the M2 light, and he can one-clip me with plenty of ammunition to spare. He's got better armor, he's got better view range, he's got better mobility, he's got a better gun. So yeah, M2 lights, Wargaming cannot balance low tiers soon enough. There's talk about them balancing it, but they've been talking about it for years. So I've switched sides. I'm still on premium ammunition because even the T2 medium is going to be a difficult prospect from the front, but we get 2 shots in. You can see we fire 2 shots with every time we pull the trigger. So 24 damage done, and I'm not going to reload quite yet. I'm going to poke, and one of the most disappointing things for me on the L-60, I'm going to mention it in the rest of the video, is the fact that for its time it had radios as standard, when most of the other tanks that existed and most of the other tanks at tier 2 were still using flags. So the signal range is not very good. As you can see, I've lost contact with the tanks on the hill because the signal range isn't very good. And the view range is absolutely awful. And again, this is a tank that had probably the most advanced optics for its time period. And once again, the view range is simply average for a tier 2. So if this tank had better signal range and better optics or better view range, as is historically accurate, you know, maybe this tank would have something, but as is, really, it's a very, very average tank. You can see we're doing our top speed, or getting close to our top speed here on good ground, getting up to 48 kilometers an hour, and I'm doing some flanking. So this is a tank where the mobility is okay, but you can see how much health that T2 medium is left on. You can see the reload is quite quick here, but I'm going to trade shots here in order to 2-clip the T2 medium. That was regular ammunition into its side. RT is now taking an interest, but this is a tank where the mobility is good enough. You can flank, you've got hit points, so you can take a shot or 2. You can use your hit points as armor. Not too often, but you can use your hit points as armor, but it's fast enough to flank. We can get to the rear of this Panzer 38T, and yeah, again, a couple of bounces, a couple of misses, 61 damage. He's still on 70 health, and gonna try and do some side scraping here. Oh, he's ignoring me. So yeah, turret traverse, not amazing, but again, it takes 2 clips to take out enemy tanks, and this is one of the disappointing things, because there's a T2 light that's now been spotted up in A1, and he's advancing this way. So once again, I'm going to advance He's got a very dangerous gun, has no problems penning me, and he can one-clip me with plenty of ammunition to spare. But he's on 110 health, and this is dangerous, so I'm hoping to ambush, get maybe some shots into him. Where is he? Oh, wow, okay, didn't spot him till very, very late. His accuracy on the move is not great, but we're only able to do about 20 or 12 damage to that guy. Yeah, so that was a whole clip, and we only did 12 damage, so basically spamming this without aiming between clips, or between shots, not good. Shooting at distance, even medium range, we missed most of our shots, but RT is trying to flank me, we can get around, finish him off, and now I know that the T2 light is coming for me, and this is problematic. So I'm on a reload, the reload is quite fast, but T2 light comes, we've got to aim a lot more carefully at close range. Look how many shots it's taking to kill this guy. Once again, 2 clips, and we can take him out. But yeah, it's just, if you come up against other autoloaders, most other autoloaders are going to have no problems penning you. Most other autoloaders can basically one-clip you, whereas it's going to take you 2 clips and a reload in there to take them out. So yeah, it's just a very, very unimpressive tank. So we're on 4 kills at the moment, 515 damage. Tanks spotted on the hill, 3 tanks left on the enemy team, Panzer 1, Panzer 2, both of which probably have autoloaders that are far, far better than mine, and then a T2 medium, and T2 medium is going to have armor I'm going to have problems with if I meet him frontally. But Panzer 2 goes down, that's the most dangerous gun on the battlefield now, dead, and we're just going to again try and flank, try and maneuver, try and get around. So the T2 medium was last spotted on the hill. I'm a little bit wary that he might still be up there, might be able to shoot down, but you can see once again the acceleration is okay, we're getting up to our top speed. Just trying to get into a position where I can get some shots into this Panzer 1. So yeah, the mobility for a tier 2 is decent, and the gun depression is decent, but the map choices at tier 2 give you very, very little opportunity to use your gun depression. And even though the mobility is quite good, the top speed isn't great compared to the other premium autoloaders, but it's good enough to get you around. Yeah, not quick enough to pick up the Panzer 1, so just doing a little bit of poking, a little bit of side scraping, trying to spot that T2 medium. He hasn't been spotted. Now I'm going to speed it up here, because this is one of the reasons I'm showing this replay, is because we go up the hill, and as you can see, we're doing about 30 kilometers an hour going uphill, so engine power to weight ratio is not terrible. But this T2 medium is on top of the hill, and we're going to get up there eventually. That's half speed, that's normal speed. And this is a very, very fortunate kill. So he's around this corner, and he's managed to tip himself, but he's on full health, and again, look at this. Every single shot's a penetration, not a single miss in there, and we do 104 damage, and he's got 66 health left. So it takes 2 clips, completely immobilized enemy tank, showing his weakest armor. Again, standard ammunition would have had problems going through him frontally, but completely helpless tank, and it still takes 2 clips to take him out, and that is one of the biggest problems I have with the L-60. But in the end, with an easy kill at the very, very end of the game, we finish up with 5 kills here on Himmelsdorf. So just the ace, no other medals, but thankfully there weren't too many M2 lights on our team that ran around picking up all the kills. So we finished up with 831 XP for that game, 685 damage, 5 kills, and really, I mean, it's a very, very average tank. You got to see that. The gun is nothing special. Even when you're firing the gun at medium range, you're going to be missing a lot of shots. So you've got to get in close, you've got to fire at close range so all your shots hit, and even then it's still going to take you 2 clips to take out enemy tanks. But overall the result was fairly good. We didn't have to fire very much premium ammunition, only 1 clip of premium ammunition, because we were in danger of running into an M2 light at the very beginning of the game, but thankfully it didn't happen. Someone else took him out, and in the end we spent most of that game firing regular ammunition, and we made a regular profit, standard tier 2 profit of about 16,000 credits. Wasn't the first game of the day, I was playing games for the review, but yeah, this tank, it's really only got one major strength, and that is its gun depression. The hit points are okay, which means you could take maybe an extra hit over other tier 2s, but yeah, it's just, you need that time, you need to take that extra hit, because it takes you so long to kill enemy tanks, even when you hit and pen every shot, and that's not a guarantee with this gun. So let's talk about crew. Is the L-60 a good crew trainer? Well, we've got 3 crew members. We got a commander, a gunner, and a driver. And to cut a long story short, no, it's a terrible crew trainer. Not because of the crew layout or because of the tank itself, but because there are only 3 light tanks in the Swedish tech tree at the moment. So even the Stridsvagn FM21 at Tier 1, we've got a commander, a driver, a radio operator, and a loader. So we're missing a radio operator and a loader because the L-60 happens to have a gunner. So 2 crew members differ from the Tier 1 to the Tier 2 premium tank. What about the Tier 2 in-game, the Stridsvagn M38, which is an L-60, and not surprisingly. So this is the Swedish Army's version of the L-60 with some improvements over the original L-60, and it's got the same crew layout as a result. The Stridsvagn M40L, again, is an L-60 with further improvements, and it's got the same crew layout. So it can train up the Tier 2 and the Tier 3 crews, and that's pretty much it, because when you get to Tier 4, unfortunately, even though the Lago is built on the L-60, or, you know, used elements, according to this, of the L-60, it was a medium tank, and it's got a completely different crew layout. You're missing a loader, and it's a medium, so it's not a light tank anymore. So there you go, you've got the Stridsvagn M38 and the M40, so that's pretty much it for Swedish light tanks, as is at the game at the time I'm recording this. So I'm going to say it is a perfect match for the Tier 2 and Tier 3, but you're not going to have crews on those tanks for very, very long. You're going to be grinding through them in about maybe 20 minutes, so I wouldn't call it a very good crew trainer. You're not going to be putting crews on this and training them up for your Tier 8s and 9s and 10s. Let's put it that way. So yeah, let's skip the crew as a result, and we'll move on to equipment now. Because it's only a Tier 2, I didn't want to put a lot of expensive equipment on, so essentially we've got not very many choices here, but toolbox, again, it's a light tank. It relies on its speed and maneuverability, so if you've got a bad crew, like I do, maybe a toolbox is viable if you've got no other options. Enhanced gun laying drive, again, improve the aim time. The aim time is bad on this tank, but are you going to spend 500,000 credits on a Tier 2 that basically you're very, very rarely going to use? It's 10% better at aiming, but the aim time is not good, and you're not going to be playing this tank very often, so 500,000 credits, even though it's a viable piece of equipment because of the aim time, I decided not to use it. But, you know, it's up to you. If you decide to go for the gun-laying drive, it's not a terrible choice, but it's only a Tier 2, and for me, it's a waste of credits. Coated optics, once again, at lower tier, I just find the coated optics, even though you are going to be on the move, you're going to be moving. 280 is not great view range for a Tier 2, but it's not terrible, so I decided I wasn't going to spend 500,000 credits on the tank. But if you want to, it's completely up to you. You'll get 28 meters of extra view range with the coated optics, so that'll take you, you know, slightly better than most Tier 2s, but I'll pretty much ignore that. I'm not going to spend 1 million credits on this tank with those 2 pieces of equipment. I did go for the binocs and the camo net because they're free, and I can just put them on the tank, and, you know, I can sit stationary when I need to for a few seconds, get that extra binoc range, and let my camo net kick in for extra camo. But I only use them because they're free. There are better equipment choices, so I would say maybe a gun laying drive and a coated optics would be better for this tank if you're going to be spending a lot of time in it, but I don't ever see myself spending a lot of time. As much as I love the L-60, I'm not going to be spending that sort of credits, or those sort of credits on it. Now, you can get enhanced torsion bars, but again, it makes the tank slightly heavier, but it does improve the suspension. I think it's a waste of time. Spall liner, complete waste of time on this tank, and then vents just improves the tank by 2.5% all round, so that's what I went for. So there are other choices, as I say. If you really want to pimp out this tank, I would probably go for improved vents, a gun laying drive, and coated optics. But for me, camo net and binocs are free, so I decided to use them, and they'll still give me an advantage in Tier 2 games. But as always, the equipment choices are up to you. Okay folks, time for the overview game, a game where I try and show you as many strengths and weaknesses of whatever tank I'm reviewing in one replay. We are here on Mines in another all Tier 2 game. But this one pretty much sums up the tank. I mean, the mobility, you can see the acceleration is decent. The top speed may not be amazing for a Tier 2. You can see the T2 light ahead of me is well into position long before I am, but we can get up to our 48 kilometers an hour even though we're going slightly uphill. So top speed not amazing, but the acceleration is okay. We can use our mobility, we can get up, and yeah, the gun, very average. So the 2 major strengths of this tank are its mobility, or its acceleration, and it's gun depression. So you're going to be able to use the gun depression on mines a little bit here, far more than you're going to be able to use it on Middengard, or far more than you're going to be able to use it on you know, what is it, Himmelsdorf, the other maps you normally get. But so I'm just up here spotting for my team, and you can see, here we go, we're bouncing at distance, we're missing at distance. You can see the accuracy at distance is not there. It is an autoloader, and because the M2 medium is angled, we're bouncing, because that is a tank we're going to have problems penning even from the front. And yeah, it wasn't until he turned to his side we were actually able to pin one. So I fired 2 clips so far at distance, and we've only done 46 damage. Now this is the problem with the tank, because it can't snipe. If you're trying to shoot this gun at anything more than, you know, medium to long range, you're going to miss. Yeah, it's going to miss. You're going to hit very few shots, so those shots you do hit are probably going to bounce. So we were only able to put 1 shot in that time, another T2 medium, maybe the same one, I'm not sure. And look, we're bouncing on the side of a T2 medium. That's 2 shots bounced on the side of a T2 medium. So I've had to switch to premium ammunition. I got spotted there, I don't have a very good crew. So took a couple of hits, no armor on the tank, so we've ended up taking 32 damage. So just trying to spot tanks here, trying to use my gun depression, and a couple of very, very heavily armored tanks on the enemy team. Lots of T2 mediums, but the other thing I wanted you to keep an eye on is the fact that we have a M2 Light in our team. And this is the problem with low-tier matchmaking. We've got an M2 Light, he's a professional M2 Light puppy kicker. M2 Light is one of his most played tanks. Now, we're shooting at distance at Arty. Arty has been spotted. We're shooting at distance from Arty, and we've only managed to land 1 shot on the enemy Arty, but we're continuing to fire blind. And again, we've only managed to land about 1, possibly 2 shots. We're bouncing on Arty at distance. This gun is just, it lets you down again and again and again. So we're able to take him out, another Arty here. Yeah, look, we're bouncing on an Su-18. We take him out, but we're bouncing and bouncing and bouncing with regular ammunition at distance at tanks with no armor. So we're able to go to work on this T2 Light. And are we going to pick up the kill? Yeah, we're going to pick up the kill for kill number 3. So we're actually doing okay. We're doing damage, we're firing, we're getting kills, but in the meantime our M2 Light is just running around the place. And this is a game where we've got 2 M2 Lights on our team, and everything on the enemy team is dying to our M2 Lights. You know, it's just, you know, low-tier matchmaking is just awful at the moment. And it's really, really no point in playing Tier 1 or Tier 2, even if you're, you know, just trying to relax or play some tanks you might actually like. I mean, I like the L-60, but the matchmaking is killing it at the moment. The map choices, the balancing, it's all awful. But once again, we can use our mobility. The mobility is okay. We can flank a Panzer II, but we don't have enough alpha. We don't have enough clip size to actually finish him off. And yeah, there we go. The M2 Light takes out the Panzer II. We actually do manage to bounce a shot miraculously. But I go for another reload, and, you know, M2 Light in the distance, and once again I've got to switch to premium ammunition because this is a tank I can't pen. I cannot pen an M2 Light with my regular ammunition, even when he gives me his side. It's unless I get a very, very lucky high RNG penetration roll, I cannot pen the side of an M2 Light. And he's got behind us, he's taking out tanks in our spawn. We're losing badly here. The score is 9-12, so it's 3 versus 6. So just reversing, trying to get as much into cover as we can. The M2 Light is trying to cap. We wait till the bushes go solid, reverse, and we're bouncing. Because he's angled, we're bouncing. You know, we managed to do, what was that, 27 damage to the M2 Light with a full clip of premium ammunition because he was slightly angled. So even the premium ammunition we're either missing or we're bouncing, we're doing very, very little damage. And if that was a one-on-one and he was firing back at me, every single shot he fired at me would probably have penned and damaged me. So Panzer II has gone in, but in the meantime we're being flanked. Now I get to use my gun depression. Okay, bushes are solid, Panzer 38T, we're still on the premium ammunition, and somehow he spotted me. Even though the bushes were solid, I got spotted. Maybe it was the M2 Light behind me, but advancing, he's disappeared. Okay, now he's back. And can we get any more shots in? Nah, a couple more shots in, but definitely not enough to kill him, and we're just wasting premium ammunition. T2 medium, you can see premium ammunition bouncing here. Our Panzer II takes out the M2 Light behind. Now there's a Cruiser 3 behind me. Okay, this is not good. Our M2 Light has picked up 5 kills, but yeah, okay, I cannot stay here with a Cruiser 2 shooting at me from behind. But our M2 Light's just gone ham. I mean, our M2 Light has, you know, gone from 3 kills each. The M2 Light is now up to 6 kills. He doesn't care. He's just driving amongst the enemy tanks, taking them out, whereas I've got to play carefully. But we do have enough to take out the Cruiser 3. We do end up taking a hit, but yeah, we do have enough. He was on low enough health to be able to take him out in a clip. But once again, I'm on 4 kills. The M2 Light's on 6 kills. And it's just low-tier matchmaking. It's just ruined. It's ruined by professional M2 Light players. So we've pulled it back. It was 3 versus 6. Now, all of a sudden, it is 3 versus 2. And again, we're trying to move in, but look how quickly that M2 Light's able to get around the map, just able to finish off the PVL-VV, and now he's going to work on the T2 medium. So maybe I should switch to premium ammunition here, but the M2 Light has no problems taking out the T2 medium. He's only on 31 health, but he's able to circle the T2 medium to death. And yeah, hasn't had to get hit at all. The T2 medium wasn't able to hit the M2 Light at all. But yeah, there you go. 8 kills for the M2 Light. So an okay game in the L-60 where basically I didn't carry the game and I didn't dominate the game, but it was still an ace. We picked up a Pascucci's medal for that. And it was on mines, which means we ended up getting to use our gun depression, and we used a little bit of our mobility, but once again you saw how underpowered the gun is for its tier, how any tank that has armor at all forces you to fire premium ammunition, and even then, you know, you're going to be lucky to pen and do any damage. And this is the main issue, the main reason I showed you this replay. It's just this, you know, a professional M2 Light player who plays the M2 Light exclusively. He's just able to run around without a care in the world, forget about angling, forget about doing any sort of tactical play, just drive straight at enemy tanks and clip them. And that's what the M2 Light does, and that's why so many people are playing M2 Lights in low tier games. So even though we had an okay game, picking up 4 kills, 717 XP and 545 damage, you could see just how overpowered the M2 Light is compared to the L-60 in an all tier 2 game. It's a very, very underpowered tank. It's a very average tier 2, but compared to some of the tanks being played at tier 2 at the moment, it is completely underpowered. So yeah, so 162 shots. We only managed to hit 93. You got to see the gun at distance and the lack of accuracy. Even when aiming, the aim time is awful, and the bloom between clips when you pull the trigger, fire 2 shots, the bloom gets quite large, causing you to miss your next 2 shots. So accuracy at medium to long range, poor. I mean, I don't know how many clips it took me to kill 2 RT, but it took a lot. And a lot of those shots were bouncing. The penetration is poor, the accuracy is poor, the aim time is poor, the gun is underpowered, the clip size and the damage is poor. I don't understand why it gets lower alpha per shot than the 2 other tier 2 Swedish tanks with their stock guns. They get more alpha even though it's the same gun. So yeah, it's just it's not a fun tank to play. As much as I love the L-60, you're going to lose money. It's not even a money maker. You're going to lose money when you get into matchups where tanks have armor and you have to fire premium ammunition. And you're going to be overclassed, completely overclassed by players who play the M2 Light. And I've gotten into games where there are 4 M2 Lights on either side, or I don't know, maybe I'm imagining it, but I think there were at least 1 or 2 games in there where maybe there were as many as 5 M2 Lights on either side, but definitely 4 is a regular occurrence. It's very rare you're going to get into a game that doesn't have at least 2 or 3 or 4 M2 Lights on either side, and they're just dominating the matchmaking at the moment. So that is my biggest problem. Lack of map choices and poor balancing at low tiers just make the L-60 not a fun tank to play. As much as I love it in real life, in game it's just not a fun tank to play. So anyway, let's get on with the review. Okay folks, time to sum up. If you haven't received, or if you never received an L-60 and it becomes available in the gift shop either on its own or as part of a package in future, is it worth buying? Or maybe you've got this tank and never played it and it's still in your garage, you're wondering if you should play it. Or maybe you sold it because it's a gift tank and it's a free garage slot and you're wondering maybe whether or not you should buy it again or get it back again. So yeah, strengths and weaknesses. Well, you know, as much as I love this tank and as much as it was so far advanced when it was built, it was a work of art when it was originally built compared to the other tanks of its time period. But Yeah, it's got some good points, I suppose. The health, you get 180 health, which is pretty good for a tier 2, so you can take those, extra hit or that extra hit or an extra couple of autoloader shots. So health isn't terrible. The power to weight ratio is pretty good on the tank, so it can accelerate up to its top speed of 48 kilometers an hour, which is not terrible. So, it's quite mobile, and it has decent health. It's also got an autoloader, so, you can, clip multiple tanks, or you can do multiple damage to multiple tanks very, very quickly with one clip. And you've got about 120 alpha damage, assuming that all your 10 shots hit and all your 10 shots go in, and then you can do essentially about 110, 120 damage, give or take RNG. So it is possible to maybe one clip some tanks you may face, maybe some tier 1s or maybe some tier 2 TDs that, don't have great health, but you're never going to be one-clipping a lot of other tanks at tier 2 and they can one-clip you. So, it's got an autoloader, and if you're not used to playing autoloaders, maybe it'll be a little bit of practice at low tier where it's not too important. So, technically, I suppose that's a strength. It's got 10 degrees of gun depression, again, pretty good, and that's pretty much it. So, it doesn't have a lot of strengths, if I'm perfectly honest. As much as I love this tank, it doesn't have a lot of strengths, but it does have a lot of weaknesses, unfortunately. It's got absolutely no armor, 13 millimeters all round, although some of it is sloped, and yeah, pretty much everything that shoots you is going to pen you. If you bounce anything, it is luck. The aim time is terrible on the tank. It's terrible for an autoloader. It's terrible on this tank, and basically it's over 1.9. It's almost 2-second aim time, and for an autoloader where you click the button and you fire 2 shots, and then you've got to go through that aim time slightly again, you're going to be missing a lot of shots as a result. So aim time is not good, even though on paper the accuracy is quite good. You're not going to be hitting all your shots all the time. You're going to be missing, especially at medium to long range. So it's got no armor. It's got poor aim time. The DPM is very, very poor for a tier 2. And as I say, the clip damage, it might be okay, assuming you're going to hit and pen all your shots, but you're never going to hit and pen all your shots. So I would say it's probably on the negative side for the gun. Overall, it's a terrible crew trainer on top of that, because there are only 3 light tanks in the game, and it only matches 2 of the 3. It doesn't even match the tier 1 for crews. So maybe that will change in future with the addition of maybe Swedish light tanks in future, but at the moment it's not a very good crew trainer. It's also quite a light tank. It's not a very, very heavy tank, so as a result you can take a lot of ram damage. I didn't actually get to show you that because I tried to avoid getting ram damage, but if you've got a heavier tier 2 or tier 3, they can ram you to death. So you're quite susceptible to ram damage because your poor armor in the tank is quite light. But the biggest negative for this tank is the fact it's a tier 2. It's not a very competitive tier 2. It's okay. I mean, if there wasn't a tank in the game called the M2 Light, this would be okay. If there wasn't a tank in the game called the Panzer II, this would be okay. If there weren't tanks in the game like the Panzer 38H, this would be okay. But there are a lot of overpowered tier 2 tanks, and they are so overpowered they've completely killed tier 2 matchmaking. An M2 Light is absolutely, it's almost like fighting a tank 2 tiers higher when you're trying to face one on an L-60. So yeah, it's just incredibly hard to play low tier games at the moment in any tank, unless your tank happens to be overpowered or is a heck of a lot better than the L-60. So it's not a lot of fun to play, even though I don't hate the tank. I really don't hate the tank. It's got a heck of a lot of weaknesses, and the way tier 2 is in the current meta, the way it is in the game at the moment, it's just horrible. It's a horrible experience playing tier 2. And for that result, as a result, the biggest negative is it's a tier 2. So essentially, I'm not going to recommend this tank, even though it's my baby, even though it's one of my favorite tanks ever. I'm not going to recommend it. I'm keeping mine. I'm never ever going to sell it, but yeah, I don't think it's worth buying. The only reason you would want to keep this tank or would want to buy it is if you're a tank collector, because you'll play a couple of games in it, you might play till it's aced, but there's no reason. You know, as a crew trainer, there's no reason in playing it, because, you know, you've already gotten past Tier 2 and Tier 3 in your Swedish Lights within the first 10 minutes of starting up the Swedish line. So, yeah, there's no reason to keep playing this tank other than for nostalgia and history's sake. So, this is a tank that you only keep if you're a tank collector or don't like selling premium tanks, but I can't recommend it otherwise. So is it worth it? As much as it pains me to say it, no, it probably isn't. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.